Welcome back all. My name is Craig Pinkney. This is the last and final session of this unit, social factors that contribute to the development of violent youth and gang impacted environments. I don't know about you, but this process has felt quite quick. But we are sadly at the last session of this particular unit. And I'd like to think that out of the 4 sessions that I have delivered for you, it's really got you to start thinking about some of the wider systemic and social factors that contribute to the development, or in layman's terms, creating that environment for the behaviors in which we may see, regardless of context, whether that's here within the UK or where you are located across the waters in beautiful sunshine in the Caribbean. And one of the things that I guess we should consider is a lot of the theories, a lot of the models, a lot of the perspectives in which I have conveyed over the last 4 sessions is up for critique. I've said this in a number of sessions before, can be adapted and be made useful in your context if some of the things may not necessarily fit. Because whilst we know some of the systemic issues are sometimes the same and similar and quite similar, in terms of the kind of culture nuances that may exist within your particular spaces may be different. And I'd like to think that this particular unit or module has enabled you to kind of think more critically about how those things ultimately apply. And just to kind of recap from last week's session, we started to really look at the relationship between violent young people, gangs and crime, which was kind of a add-on from session 2. But just to kind of specify in terms of the summary of some of the things that we had previously covered. And then also we started to look at the impact of family in socialization and its process of socialization of young people and the reasons for the development of deviance and what that was ultimately all about. If you remember, we were kind of looking at the way in which children are developed, the way in which they learn, whether that is from school, whether that's from within a community, whether that's within the household, whether that's within a religious institution. That ultimate socialized process is what makes each and every one of us who we are. And there's also thinking about things like attachment. We looked at adverse childhood experiences and a number of theoretical models that kind of would enable us to kind of think about, I guess, answering the most important question, why? Why do we have some of the issues that we see amongst our children and young people within our communities? And I guess this particular session is more specific and focused. So today's session, we're going to be looking at the reasons why girls join gangs or young women join gangs, and I guess the impact it has on women. But I would like to also extend that because, I like to give extra gems in our session and how that also impacts community and the way that impacts the way in which we as professionals may respond and also reduce issues going back to marginalization and reducing some of the impacts that they may exist. And if you remember, I always keep talking about removing or moving to a space of from social disorganization to social organization. And I think the last 2 units in which I've covered and delivered most definitely is going to get you all to start thinking about reduction, desistance, and these are all going to be terminologies that you will learn about in ultimately modules to come. And I think, why do we have these conversations? I think, from a perspective, as a criminologist, as a practitioner, having these conversations about gangs or street gangs or organized criminal groups in a wider context, oftentimes we generally only focus on men and only talk about men. So even when we're talking about the process of why children and young people join gangs, by default, we oftentimes think about men as the predominant individuals or groups of people that conform or join those particular groups. And yes, whilst we know that, when we look at the ratio between men and women in terms of violence, in terms of violent behaviors that may exist in community, yes, most definitely it's generally males that dominate that particular space in terms of the statistics. But I think it's important that we have these conversations about where young women, where girls play in the role of gangs, organized criminal groups. And that's the reason why we have developed this particular session, for us to have that question. And I think what we can do also here as well is extend the conversation. So you may want to take a moment for your teams, your groups, to have a think about why it's important that we discuss young women, young girls, as it relates to street gangs or organized criminal groups. And I think one of the things I think is also really important is that we start to look at what is happening amongst our children and young people, specifically females, in the current climate. You remember, I always keep talking about us understanding young people in the current context. And I believe that whilst we're talking about, gangs, young people that are involved in violent behaviors, we can't miss out the impact that it has on young women, because it definitely does have an impact. And one of the things, just in conclusion, just to convey in this particular session, is really to kind of get you all to kind of unpack and start to think about what that ultimately may mean. So we will go through what is required in terms of your learning outcomes, but I will throw things out there, as I always do, just to get us to think about, just to get us to discuss about a number of issues that may pertain to particular young people. And just again, if whilst you're watching this particular video, you want to pause or you want to stop and utilize that as an opportunity to have further discussions, by all means do so. I don't want you to feel that you're going to be just glued to this webinar without having the opportunity to process, as well as having these conversations amongst your peers. And I guess when we think about the challenges, when we're thinking about young women, young girls, or whatever you prefer to utilize in terms of describing young women in your particular context, I guess these are some of the common challenges in which what the literature demonstrates. And I think one of the key things is around understanding, do we understand the complex needs surrounding young women that are linked to street gangs or organized criminal groups? And again, that may be a topic of discussion. Do we understand how complex it is for young women that are linked to street gangs or organized criminal groups? What literature have we read around this issue around girls and gangs? Or are we just looking at literature that's mainly male focused? And I think part of our learning, our awareness, our understanding, and most importantly about our strategies to respond to children and young people, women in particular, I think it's important that we do a little bit of research around some of the issues which we're going to convey today. I think the second question is around validity. Is it reliable? Is the information that we're reading around young women, is it reliable? So what I'm also going to do in today's session is going to throw out a few what I call red herrings, in the sense that some of the literature that's out here within the UK oftentimes deters us away from understanding the impact of young women within our particular context. And I will provide a series of critiques that will go along with that. Another challenge is the interventions that are oftentimes discussed around young women tends to focus solely on exploitation. And what that ultimately means is that when we think about kind of a national response or a local response, predominantly here within the UK, and again, I want you to think about this within your context, it only focuses on exploitation, meaning it only focuses on generally to do with sex. So women that have entered into gangs that have been used as sexual objects amongst the group, or to be used in other forms of, for example, prostitution, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the interventions around organizations wanting to respond to young women only focuses on that particular issue, and also issue around domestic violence or any other form of abuse. And I'm not suggesting that that's wrong as an intervention, but what is important is that when we're thinking about the context of street gangs holistically, when we're talking about males and females, I think it's important that we have that acknowledgement that sometimes there is there's no equality or equity in the way in which we strategize towards engaging with both young boys and young women. And we shouldn't just look at violence. We shouldn't just look at enabling young boys to build their resilience. We shouldn't just focus on young men in terms of their identity and so on and so forth. But for young women, we only look at sex, sexual exploitation, prostitution, abuse of all forms, and so on and so forth. Why? Because just like young males, they go through some of those problems too. Now, the research and the data may not necessarily suggest that, but I think it's important that we have that acknowledgement that for both males and females, they may have some of the issues as it relates to the challenges that they're presented. And I guess one of the last challenges I'm sure you'll be aware of is the limited resources and extensive caseloads that oftentimes are out there to engage young women that may be affected by gangs, street gangs, organized criminal groups, or violence? And do we utilize those resources in the same way that we engage young boys? And again, that reinforces the last point that I just made about the focus. So whilst we put a lot of resource into engaging young men, which obviously because young men are probably the ones that are more involved in issues around violence, that doesn't mean that the same amount of resource is not beneficial to young women that may be impacted by those particular issues. So it's just getting us to be connected with some of the wider systemic issues, again, social factors that create those environments in the same way that young men may behave in a particular type of way, to understand that that may also impact or adversely impact young women too. And I think this is part of the problem as well, is that when we try to understand, when we try to make sense of what young women or young girls, or in terms of their role in terms of gangs, we've always looked for a definition. And if you remember, one of the challenges that I presented in this particular unit or module was around how do we define gangs? And I also demonstrated that within a UK or European context, that we haven't come to a consensus. Why? Because a lot of our understanding that is written within the literature across the West is generally through an American context. And as I said, that the American context or the American experience is ultimately different to a UK or British context. And the same will apply to you in your context. It may be very different. So whilst a lot of the literature, which I said previously, is it reliable? Is it valid? When we're trying to understand what young women are, when it comes to the role that they play within gangs or criminal organizations, what is the context? And I think one of the bigger challenges is when we try to define girls and gangs, you know, talking from a British context, is that you can't, because we can't compare sometimes the role, the behaviors that we may see from young men and expect to see the same thing as women. But what do I mean by that? Does that mean that women are less of a role as it plays in street gangs? No, it doesn't. But it may mean that their roles are more unique. And it's about establishing what that unique role is. So if you remember in session 2, I spoke about a series of models that we can look at and we can adapt. And you may remember I spoke about Simon Holsworth and Tara Young's 3-point typology. You remember? So it was 3 key definitions on what we see as it relates to peer groups, street gangs, organized criminal groups. And if you remember, I adapted it to my context in order for it to make sense in a part of the UK, in Birmingham, the West Midlands, where I live and where I do a lot of my work. That part in Birmingham in the UK, I adapted that particular model to fit. And if you remember, I also said is that what you might want to do in terms of your discussions amongst your peers is to do something similar. And I'm saying the same thing here as it relates to young women. In your particular context, how do young women operate? How do they behave? What are the roles that they play? Because the roles may be very different to young women here within the UK, that also may be very different in America, and also may be very different in the context of the Caribbean. And I believe that this is a particular opportunity to have that conversation about defining what we mean in a localized context. And I think when we talk about the challenges for women specifically, I would argue that their challenges are no different to young men. When I think about it in a British context, and again, I want you to utilize this as part of your discussions in your context, but when from a UK context, you know, we can look at some contemporary literature that looks at, you know, the impacts of, you know, some of the systemic issues here in the UK as it relates to poverty, as it relates to austerity, as it relates to cuts within services, you know, lack of opportunity, high unemployment, and all of the factors in which I've mentioned previously in session 1. And if you also remember the marginalization unit, where we covered some of the root causes and the systemic issues, the ripple effect or the consequences of that, I would say, is the same for young women. So issues around mental health. So it's not just exclusive to young boys that may be impacted by mental health, and their emotional, psychological well-being may be impacted by being involved in a lot of those issues and links to some of the socialization conversations that we had in last week's session. So mental health is also a major issue. There are a lot of young women here within the UK context that are missing from education, not in school, not being educated. So what are they doing with their time? How are they being engaged? And how vulnerable are they if they're not being engaged by the state, local community organizations, so on and so forth? For a lot of young women, just like young men, they may be at risk at home. What do I mean? So we're talking about issues here of like domestic violence. We're talking about abuse of all forms, whereas school, other forms of education, or community projects that exist within the community, or sporting projects that may exist, or religious institutions that may be doing an array of community initiatives within the community, that may be a space or a safe haven for a lot of young women. But what if there's a lot of cuts within your local community that a lot of those services can't run? And whilst those young people may have found that safe haven, being in those particular spaces and being engaged at school and so on and so forth, a lot of them are inside of a household where there may be issues of violence, where there may be issues of abuse in all forms. So here within the UK, as this relates to the particular pandemic of COVID-19, our situation here is that all of the schools are closed. Our situation here is that all of the resources that is linked to children and young people and their engagement have been restricted because of trying to contain this particular virus. And again, as a consequence of that, young people are not in education and not being engaged, and they're also vulnerable to being at risk at home. So that's what that means in a UK context. But again, I want you to think about that in yours and see if there's any kind of similarity in that conversation. And I think the wider conversation, as we mentioned, around vulnerability is to do with poverty. You know, we've spoke about this previously in sessions before, but not having money, I'm sure you'll agree, of the issues that ultimately can bring when children and young people live in particular environments of poverty, and what poverty may cause or create in particular environments. Likewise, the young boys, young women are making risky behaviors that may be to do with things like drugs, substance misuse, you know, them drinking, them taking particular drugs, and what is the impact that has on them, on their behaviors, the way that they think, and so on and so forth. And I think also the idea about risky behaviors is also a vulnerability as well, which is also oftentimes linked to deviant friendship groups. So it's not only young boys make those decisions to join particular groups that may be involved in forms of criminality, young women do as well. And especially when we're talking about risky behaviors, as it relates to issues around boyfriends, as it relates to siblings, even meaning an older sibling may be involved in a local street gang, or you have an older cousin, or you have an uncle, or you have a father. And oftentimes those risky behaviors are sometimes linked to those particular things. And then we've also got to talk about vulnerability around homelessness. You know, we've mentioned poverty, we've mentioned issues around, you know, lack of resources, high unemployment. And that means there are going to be some young women that may be out of home, and they may not have intimate or immediate family or an extended family that can pick them up. And sometimes they may fall into those situations where they become sexually exploited. They may end up in groups that may be utilizing them for prostitution and so on and so forth. So whilst here in the UK, a lot of that happens with a lot of young women that are found to be homeless, I'm assuming that the same thing may happen in your context too. And again, this is an opportunity to have those conversations. And then I think the ripple effect on that, when we're talking about mental health and all of the things that we've just mentioned, the increase of issues around self-harm and suicide is most definitely on the increase here within the UK. And I would even say over the last 12 months, in the middle of this pandemic, that has increased. Mental health has gone up the roof in terms of the impact of young people, anxiety, depression, young people feeling that they're impacted by a lot of traumatic experiences that they have encountered within this last 12 months, and the fact that they can't express that, the fact that they can't access counselors, the fact that they can't access therapy and other interventions that can support them with their mental health, has led to also an increase into self-harm and suicide. And again, one of the things that you may want to do as an activity is just have a discussion, and you may just want to write down probably about 5 or 10 things that you may see in your locality or you're aware of in terms of the profile of vulnerabilities of young women in your particular spaces. And I think one of the conversations when we talk about being critical about what I say, the data, and whether that data or research is valid or whether it's reliable, part of the reason is we as professionals, and I'll say this in a holistic sense, that we do not invest a lot of time in listening to the voices of young women and their expressions, their thoughts, their narratives. And as a part of action research, and this is just another gem that I like to just throw out from time to time. Now, for some of you that are interested in trying to get the voices of young women, one of the things that you may want to do is look at what action research is. And just in a nutshell, this is where organizations or individuals like yourselves can come up with, for example, a series of questionnaires. So you create a little bit of a survey in your locality that you can get the real life experiences, perspectives of young women that may be impacted by violence, by criminality, by exploitation in your particular locality, your particular area, because then it will give you a better understanding of, one, the awareness of what's going on the ground, but secondly, in terms of creating strategies that are realistic, strategies that are achievable, and strategies that feel good, that we're working with integrity in particular communities. So sometimes things like action research is something that is very impactful when you're really trying to get the understanding of young women. Now, this is my critique of the research that takes place in the UK. And some of you may share these perspectives that I have. Some of you may disagree, but that's fine. I think the debate and conversation is good when we're having this this opportunity to explore some of the wider issues that impact our young women in this context of gangs. Now, a lot of the research that is out here within the UK, and I would also say from a European context, generally only speaks to young women that have been sexually exploited. So whilst those narratives of young women, whilst they've had a experience or they've come into contact with street gangs where they have been sexually exploited, what that does ultimately to the wider conversation about young women and street gangs is that it starts with an assumption. And that assumption is all young women that join gangs or are part of gangs get sexually exploited. Are you seeing my point? So whilst all of the research and a lot of the research that ask young women that have been sexually exploited, what they haven't taken the time to do is express the voices and the narratives of some young women that haven't been exploited. So what am I saying in context? What am I saying in conclusion? That yes, there are women that do get sexually exploited in gangs. But the question I'm asking is, do all women get exploited in gangs? And if the research is only suggesting that women that come into contact with street gangs only get sexually exploited, you then can understand that the interventions that are rolled out by our government tends to focus solely on exploitation, which goes back to the original challenges that I posted. Are you seeing my point? And one of the things that becomes really important, and especially for yourselves that are thinking about engaging with young women, and I know that a lot of you do work specifically with young women, is trying to get that wider understanding of what's taking place. So yes, exploitation may take place. Yes, sexual exploitation also may take place. But is that the true picture and the holistic picture of the story? So one of the things that I'm going to quickly do is just give you a few perspectives of young women here in the UK. And I actually want you to do this as an activity amongst your peers to think about some of the case studies, and also keep it anonymous, some case studies where young men or young women specifically have told you about an experience being in a street gang, and utilize those case studies as an opportunity to think about how you would respond, how you would engage. More importantly, as I said earlier, in terms of the two levels, Number one, raising that awareness so you have a complete understanding, which goes back to my original challenges. You remember when I said, you know, are we understanding of the complex issues as it relates to young women that are involved in street gangs or organized criminal groups? And by doing this activity that I'm talking about right now and utilizing your frontline experience, your engagement with young women that may have come into contact with street gangs, those perspectives are going to form your action for how you deter, respond, reduce issues as it relates to young women specifically in your locality, in your particular region. So this is case study number one. And this is a series of points and narratives. And again, I have kept it anonymous. But what I just want you to do is just hear some of the perspectives in which these young women had said, and just think about it in your context. So again, just as a disclaimer, you know, forgive any inappropriate language. What I have done is I have censored the words, but I think it's also important that when we're working with young people on the street, that we get that real life, that real opportunity to understand what those true perspectives are. Because oftentimes when we kind of whitewash or we water down the perspectives of young people, then the responses are not oftentimes according. So this is a testimony of one young woman. So she said, when I was 14 years old, I started linking, in a UK context means meeting, a 19-year-old boy who I met near a school and was in a gang. He oftentimes used to try to persuade me to give him oral sex for weeks, and I would say no. And then one day after school, I just said yes. He told me just keep it on the low because he didn't want everyone to know his business, which I thought made perfect sense because I'm a quiet person too. She said, well, I kind of told my friend, but I swear I didn't mean for everyone to find out. She then said, it doesn't matter anyway, because I'm not going to go back to school for him to get his girl cousins to punch or to beat me up. Case study number 2. This young woman said, listen, I've known these guys all my life. I'm not in no gang. They're just my people. When I got shot that time in the party, it's only because one stupid guy that owed my boy some money got scared, thinking man was going to rob him, and he shot into the crowd. But you know what? I'm not saying no names though, because we don't do the snitching thing around here. Case study number 3. This young woman said, so I slept with 3 men in the same group. So what? When guys sleep with multiple women, they're called the man. So why am I called a particular name when I've slept with 3 boys? Craig, you tell me. She said, yeah, so what? If they're from the same set, meaning the same group. No one forced me to do anything. My friend got passed around by some of them, but that's not me. And she starts laughing. Case study number 4. This young woman said, listen, no one around here can tell me nothing. If anyone tried to violate me, I just call my brothers, I call my cousins, and I call anyone. And you know that anyone that's involved is going to get stabbed or shot. You think we care about police? Listen, my uncle's out here doing life. My other brother is doing some time for a shooting. And my little cousin is serving time for that stabbing last year that I told you about that happened in our local city centre. Case study number 5. This young woman said, what really hurt me the most is that my so-called friend for 16 years was the one who sent the naked videos of me on WhatsApp to a boy she claimed raped her after a party. Him and his boys made some group on Instagram and started posting the videos and tagging all of the girls that I don't like. She then held her face. She then sighed. The amount of things that I've told this girl, the amount of times we've gone out of town and we've done some mad things. And she sold me out to a rapist. She probably deserved it anyway. So as you can see, a series of testimonies just from the young women that I have engaged with here within the UK. And this is what action research is, that we as professionals utilize that opportunity to question, engage young people that may have gone through a series of experiences that can inform our practice. And that's the purpose of the action research. You know, not to name and shame and not to just be so over critical as workers about how young people talk or how they express themselves, but an opportunity to hear their narratives, hear their voices, because they may feel alienated and marginalized. And we utilize those voices as an opportunity for ourselves to inform our practice and to inform each other's practice. And that's how we become competent. That's how we become more aware of what's taking place in a present context within your localized particular space. So I don't want you to use these particular examples. I want you to consider your own. I want you to think about these particular examples in your context. And as I said in the beginning, you may actually want to do this as an activity. Think about 5 or 6 or 5 to 10 scenarios or situations. You can break off as groups and think of a scenario situation that a young person has conveyed to you, specifically a young woman, and how that may impact or has impacted them on their mental health, on their emotional health, their well-being, and the way in which they think about the world from their new lens based on the issues that ultimately take place. And through these particular narratives, through these particular expressions that I've utilized within my work to inform my practice and also to support the practice of my peers and also individuals that are in a series of fields or sectors around engaging with children and young people, is sometimes we need to dispel some of the myths around girls and gangs. Because as I've said before, that a lot of the literature within a UK context only focuses on sexual exploitation. It doesn't give us a flavor of some of the other things that may also impact some of the young women. And these are some of the myths. And one of the myths are boys are at more risk of being negatively affected by gangs and their involvement as opposed to young women. And that's false. I would say girls are just like young boys at risk, the same. I wouldn't say boys are more at risk. I wouldn't say girls are more at risk. I would say it's equal. What we may see though is a difference in expression in terms of the outcome, meaning we may probably see violence. So that's easy to kind of understand. It's easy for us to put that within the data, that because we see violent behaviors and activities, it's easy for us to understand the correlation between young boys that end up in gangs and the behaviors that come on the back of being involved in gangs or criminality. Whereas young women may not demonstrate the level of violence, but they may be involved in some things. And by default, because we're looking at violence versus other behaviors, we automatically put young men at the top as being more negatively at risk. But I would say the role, going back to the point I said earlier, it's about ascertaining and understanding and making sense of the role of young women, because sometimes women may actually have a more strategic position within that particular group that actually young men then go out and engage in those particular behaviors. The second thing that I think it needs to be dispelled as a myth is that not all girls in gangs are being sexually exploited. So whilst young women do get sexually exploited, and I don't want to miss or be missed in terms of that particular point, so I'm not suggesting that young women are not sexually exploited, but to make the assumption that all women that are involved in street gangs are sexually exploited, I believe is inaccurate. And just like those particular case studies, and again, why I'm inviting you all, to think about those case studies of young women that you may have engaged with, or if you do start to engage with young women, gather some data of case studies, live, real ones, make them anonymous that you can utilize to better understand, and also inform or train your fellow colleagues. Another myth that I believe needs to be dispelled as well is that there's a sexual ritual that all girls have to go through to be accepted. And again, that's kind of linked to the kind of sexual exploitation conversation that a lot of the research that's out there kind of makes this suggestion that women have to go through a kind of sexual ritual. They have to do all of these favors in order to be accepted as a group. And I'm going to say it again, I am not suggesting that young women may have not gone through those particular experiences, but to make the assumption that all young women go through that particular process, again, is inaccurate and is false. And I think it's important that we understand when we're talking about the myths is the role, you keep hearing me using the term role, that young women actually play significant roles within gangs. You heard me allude to the fact slightly earlier when I spoke about things like the girlfriend, the wife, the sister, the aunt, the grandma, the mum. They actually can play some very significant roles as it relates to gangs and organized criminal groups. Let's think about the context of the mafia. A lot of people kind of have ideas of, gangs based on what we see in Hollywood and the understanding of the mafia. Now, in the UK, we have, Albanian mafias. These are all Eastern European groups. We have Turkish mafias. We have Italian mafias. We have Chinese particular mafias that exist. And these would be classified, or particular crime families. And these are individuals are well known to be bringing in the Class A substances into our country and also smuggling firearms from different parts of Europe into the country. And as you and I know, at some point in time ends up into the hands of our young people in our local community. But the point that I'm making is that when you look at the kind of context of the mafia, and you just watch any film in Hollywood, what is the role of the woman? Is that woman seen as inferior? Or is she seen as somebody that is significant? What role does mum play? Now, I like to watch Netflix. I like things like Narcos. I like watching things like Breaking Bad. I like to watch things like Ozark, things like Snowfall. And these are just programs that are online, that are drama series around crime. And all of the women that are in those particular mafia style dramas or documentaries even, they all play significant roles. Sometimes the woman is the most significant because she is the individual that calls the shots. She is the individual that makes the decisions. She is the individual that is seen to be involved in the kind of monetary gain, holding the accounts, making sure the money's right, making sure that the connections between different groups are consistent and accurate. So whilst we may see the men that are involved in the violence, that doesn't lessen the role of the young woman in the context of the particular gang. And this is the point that I've been making about the research that's out there that goes back to the last point about putting women in a submissive position, putting women in an inferior position. So when you think about gangs within the context of the Eastern Caribbean even, what are the roles that young women play? Are all women inferior or are women actually superior based on their roles? And as I said, mummy is normally seen as somebody that is significant if we're talking about crime families. Sisters, girlfriends, wives, mistresses even are seen as significant roles because they may be involved in the transportation in firearms, the transportation in terms of drugs, the transportation in terms of people. They may also supply women, may also supply men in terms of muscle, security, so on and so forth. So here we have it that women in a gang context actually play significant roles. But when we watch a lot of documentaries and when we read a lot of literature, oftentimes it doesn't really talk about the role of young women in that particular case. And I think it's important that we have those conversations around dispelling some of those myths as it pertains to young women. And just to conclude the point, how we kind of arrive at that is the action research, is the frontline perspectives. So your perspectives are going to be really important in this. Not just your perspectives, but the perspectives of the young people that you engage, so you can really kind of take hold of some real frontline experience, perspective, voices, unheard voices that you can utilize a part of your practice. And ultimately, that's what we want. We want to develop ourselves to a point where we're able to respond at a particular level. So just to conclude that point, dispelling the myths around girls and gangs, I think is important when we're trying to get to a particular place. And I think when we talk about then what the young women gain, from being involved in gangs, organized criminal groups, I think at this particular point now, we should be thinking, well, the gain would be the same as young men, which I'm agreeing with. There is no difference. And I think when we go back to kind of some of the models that we've already thought about, before, we're talking about attachment, we're talking about identity crisis, if you remember, when we're talking about belonging, being seen, that double consciousness, those labeling theories, and we spoke about a number of things that may drive a particular young boy to want to be involved in gangs. But I would argue that the same things are ultimately there for young women. And if you remember in session 2, in my research, I talk a lot about gangs being surrogate families. And remember, we were talking about the notion of need. And one of the things we were talking about from the context of need, if you remember, is that ultimately street gangs, organized criminal groups, what they do as a consequence is they replace and fulfill all of the needs that we as adults in our societies are not able to fulfill for those children or young people. So when we're talking about young women specifically, it operates in the exact same way that young boys are. Young women want money too. They want to eat too. Why? Because everybody else does. We do. They want their safety needs to be met. And especially if women are living in an environment where it's highly sexualized, young men behave a particular type of way. Things like sexual exploitation is something that will make them potentially vulnerable. And if you think about all of the vulnerabilities that I've mentioned previously, most definitely those things are ultimately there. We spoke about identity. So young women are going to want to belong. Going to want to feel loved just like young boys. They want to build their self-esteem and have some self-confidence and want to be seen in the world through a lens in which there's respect, and they're seen and put in high regard for the things that they can contribute. So they reach their full and their potential. They ultimately understand what their purpose is, which is what self-actualization ultimately is all about. So just like how young boys have needs, and human beings, including us as adults, have needs that need to be filled, specifically, so do young women as well. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there is no difference. There is no difference in terms of need as it relates to young men versus young women. The need is ultimately the same. And I believe that a lot of the decisions that are made by young boys and young girls are ultimately very similar, but the outcomes, going back to the point, may be very different. So you may see a lot more things around aggression, violent behaviors that come from a lot of young boys, young men in particular, where for young women, it may be through sexualization. And it's important that we have these conversations. And again, I'm talking here specifically from a UK context, a British context, and it might just be important that you have these conversations according to your narratives. And again, it may be very similar, it may be the same, you may be like, Craig, it's exactly the same over here within the Eastern Caribbean, and that's also fine as well. But I think it's important that we utilize this opportunity here again to have those deeper conversations and ultimately what that might look like. And what this also links to is a previous conversation that we had around the impact of, remember, mass multimedia from your marginalization sessions, do you remember? And we were talking about things like how things like social media, creates particular environments. You remember we spoke about globalization. You remember, so this is testing now. I'm throwing things at you now to test you all. And what you might want to do is just test each other, close your books, close your notepads, and throw out words like social disorganization, throw out words like globalization, throw out words like double consciousness, throw out words like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, throw out words like attachment theory, and test each other to see if you remember. Because one of the beautiful things about when we talk about literature and we talk about models and academic perspectives is how we can merge them into our understanding and our frontline experiences. And that's what keeps us sharp. That's what keeps us constantly adapting the things that we hear and we learn in the context from when you're working. And again, we have to talk about young women in the context of dominant youth cultures. And I think one of the things that we've also explored is the role of hypermasculinity. Do you remember? And whilst we were talking about hypermasculinity, I think it begs to differ a really interesting question that needs to be asked. And I think is one that's continuously being asked now within the literature. And I guess that question is what is the role of or the impact of hypermasculine young men and the impact on young women? So when we're talking about, going back to my point again about the roles of young men and young women in a street gangs context, what is the impact of those men that are aggressive, are angry, are hypermasculine, and move in a particular type of way all the time? What is the impact that has on young women? Because when we talk about, again, from a British context, we see those impacts. And what are those impacts when we're talking about that in a globalized context? The way that young women speak, the language, the slang and the terminologies that they use locally is exactly the same as the young men. Also, their behaviors are quite aggressive and also sometimes mirror the way in which young boys behave. So one of the things I always say to professionals or parents that I do a lot of work with is I always tell them to jump on the school bus. So over here, the school closes at about, or shuts at about 3:15, 3:15, or about 3:30 Monday to Friday when school is open, of course. And I always encourage people to get onto the school bus and listen to how the young women are communicating amongst each other, and especially when they're amongst males. And one of the observations that I've most definitely heard and seen is young women have this type of hyper femininity about them. So like I was talking about hyper masculinity, which again is kind of the exaggeration of aggression and masculine behaviors, we're now starting to see that amongst young women. And that links to the way that young women also behave and how they view themselves in a wider society, going back to things like double consciousness again. And this is how you can link some of the identity conversations that we've had previously to the point that I'm making right now. So whilst young women are now becoming this hyper femininity, kind of enter into that hyper feminist type of space, where they're kind of exaggerating beauty, exaggerating their behavior, exaggerating their independence, and so on and so forth, is as a consequence by default from those male behaviors. And whilst those young men are trying to find, I guess, the what I call the balance or the thin line between what is a man versus what is a hyper masculine or alpha male, and whilst they're trying to judge that temperature of what that's supposed to be, in that particular context, women that are viewing young men are sometimes also trying to find themselves as young women in that same society. So whilst a young boy is 13, 14 years old that is discovering his manhood, and he may discover that manhood through the form of aggressive men, you know, men that are domestically violent, men that behave a particular way around women, young women are also being socialized, going back to that point again, in that same context, thinking that they have to either conform or behave in a particular type of way in order to be seen, to be heard, and to be accepted in the context of hypermasculine males that behave a particular type of way. Now, I want to pause there to just get us to just process what I've just said, because I think it's important that we have opportunities to kind of process some of that information. And whilst we're talking about hypermasculine young men and its impact on young women, that also may help us to understand some of the aggressive, violent behaviors that we see from young women within the context of street gangs. So within the UK context, we see a lot more young women now carrying knives. We see a lot more young women now holding firearms. We know there's a lot more young women now that are being shot as a consequence of being around young men that are involved in day-to-day criminal activities as it relates to being involved in gangs. And that is important. So when we're talking about identity and revisiting the conversation around identity, we have to talk about hypermasculinity and the role that hypermasculinity from young men and its impact on young women, and what is the adverse impact of that on other young women. And then we also have to go back to the conversation of social media too, because what is social media doing in order to globalize that mindset? So I would say that a lot of the stuff that we see coming out of America, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, Detroit, Miami, a lot of the kind of globalized context of the way that young women behave, the way that they talk, the way that they kind of have this independence about them is by default based on the environments that they're in. But based on social media, remember, as I said before, by a click of a button, I don't need to leave the UK. I don't need to leave my room right now to understand how women behave in the Eastern Caribbean. You don't have to leave the Eastern Caribbean to find out how young men and young boys behave here within the UK. You can just go onto YouTube. You can just go to Instagram. And there's so many ways in which you can find out how people behave. This is how things become dominant cultures. That's how fashion is shaped. This is how music shapes fashion. This is how people dress a particular type of way. The terminologies in terms of language is expressed in a particular type of way through globalization. Because remember, globalization is about how we become forever interconnected based on our communication, our experiences, and also as it's relating to trade also as well. And I think that's where music and fashion from multinational corporations ultimately comes in through that particular conversation. So it's important that we understand that within context. And again, when we talk about that kind of global idea of globalization, you know, it's important that we also understand as well that when we're talking about impacts on young men, again, we have to talk about the impact on young women because the narratives are almost the same. You know, listen to the music, the content. So again, in session number 2, I told you to kind of explore, you know, some of the conversations that young people may have as it pertains to things like music. And on the marginalization module, I also got you to think about those things as well within context. And what is the impact on young women? You know, they're also expressed and told that, you know, having the latest handbag, having the latest shoes, you know, having the latest car, having the latest watch. But how do you achieve that specifically for young women? So the narrative of over-sexualized behavior, the narrative of being involved in selling drugs, the transportation of drugs, concealing drugs, being involved in fraud in all forms, and young women then kind of demonstrating that or uploading that onto social media platforms for other young women to be coerced, to be motivated, or to be inspired by those particular images that are rolled out by other women. And in the same way that young men are being socialized in a social media realm is the same way in which young women are being socialized in a social media space, where they're able to kind of think about all of the things that they're able to achieve, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that they can achieve certain things, but the things that are available to them are things that are linked to deviance. So just like our young boys are told that if you want to make that money, you want to make it big, you got to sell drugs. You got to be involved in fraud. If you want that Rolex watch, if you want that nice Range Rover, if you want that Louis Vuitton bag, if you want those Chanel trainers, Chanel shoes, the Christian Louboutin shoes, Chanel handbags. And if you want to do all of that, you want to achieve all of that, because we know education is not available to all, because we know some people are not involved in education, because we know some people are coming from dysfunctional families, because we know that some people are on the poverty line, because we know that people don't have an income. In order to get these things, the only way you're going to achieve that is through illegal means. And again, the same way in which young men are being coerced and inspired in a social media globalized context, young women are also a victim of that too. And that way, and that goes back to my previous point about we have to dispel the myths, because it's not just young boys that are observing these particular platforms. It's not just young boys that are adversely impacted by these images and being forced by default to think about negative things in order for them to make it. And then the question then is that you all should be asking then, and I think maybe another activity is, well, then how do you respond? What then is the counter narrative? How do we think about ways in which we're going to engage young women specifically through the means or organizations that we can have? And I think one of the things we need to think about is, well, first and foremost, what is our counter narrative? You know, what is the response from our perspective? First of all, do we understand going back to the original challenges that I said in the beginning, because when we have an understanding of what the problem is, then we can then start thinking about those potential solutions. Do we have an understanding of social media? Are we on social media? And if we are on social media as organizations and individuals that have organizations, what are the messages that you're putting out specifically to young women, not just to young men, but also to young women? What interventions are you rolling out specifically towards young women? Have you as an organization looked at what your strengths and weaknesses are? So then you're able to kind of have an understanding of what needs to be built, developed in order to make your colleagues, your workers, better at being able to engage with these particular issues. What are those experiences? Going back to the action research stuff again, and how are you utilizing those experiences, not just from yourself in terms of lived experiences, but those experiences of individuals that are going through those day-to-day struggles, those day-to-day trials and tribulations. And then how are you analyzing that to inform your practice for it to be best practice? Because then when you have those kind of stages in terms of how you think about the experiences of predominantly young women that are involved in these particular scenarios, then we can understand in terms of the strategy and how we respond. And that goes back to a previous point that I made about defining what's happening within your context. Because your intervention that may be for a young woman that is significant and plays a significant role in a gang may be very different to a young woman that's on the periphery, meaning a young woman, young girl that is, you know, on the beginning stages of being involved in a group that may be considered deviant or antisocial. So the intervention for those two different young women, for example, is going to be completely different, because one may be susceptible to the intervention, whereas the other may be so entrenched in those particular behaviors, it may require that there is a different type of intervention. And this is why it's important that we understand the landscape. This is why it's important that we have knowledge of the landscape, we have knowledge of the groups in which we're trying to engage in the community. But if we're only assuming that all young women are involved in street gangs on the basis of sexual exploitation, that may help us to understand, even from a UK context, why we're failing young women at a rapid rate that are getting caught up in those particular behaviors. And I think there's a wider conversation that we need to have here about the notion of healing. And I don't think that this is exclusive to young boys. I believe it's exclusive to not just the young women that we engage, but also for practitioners too. And I think this is something that I think we need to have a wider conversation about as well, because I always talk about in my work that we all need therapy. And one of the things that oftentimes happen is those of us that get into this type of work is oftentimes because of a personal experience. So we're almost like kind of the wounded healer, that we go into this particular work because we have had a background, we've had an experience, we've had an experience that may be linked to someone in family that has been impacted by street gangs, by violence, by conflict. And as a consequence of that, that is what's motivated or inspired us to want to engage in this particular type of work, because we want to help other young women or young men, for example. But I always say that we as practitioners also need to go for a process of healing, because if we are individuals that don't go through a process of healing, then how are we trying to heal others that are also in a place where they're broken? So I say that there's also another level of conversation when we're talking about, you know, social factors as we bring this unit or module to an end, because it's also talking about how do we heal as a society. If we're talking about things like adverse childhood experiences, we also have to talk about things like intergenerational trauma, trauma that's been passed down throughout the generations, trauma that's been passed down from colonialism, from slavery, and the impact of that that's had on our communities and the way that we look at each other, the way that we behave towards each other, the way that we respond to violence, the way that our communities respond in terms of that silence that exists within our community, and how ultimately we're going to get to a place of healing, to a place of effective action. So when we talk about social organization in context, even from a British context, I know as a Black man that there's something that needs to take place even within our communities, because that intergenerational legacy of trauma, even though being here in the UK has definitely been passed down from my grandparents that have come here from the Caribbean, and most definitely has impacted our parents. And when I look around my community, you see the ripple effects of that. So one of the homeworks that you can do is look up a theory known as post-traumatic slave syndrome. I'll say that again, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And when you kind of look up that, you'll understand some of the conversations around intergenerational trauma. Because whilst we're talking about some of the social factors, and whilst we've mentioned things like trauma over the last 4 sessions, it is important that we also look at things in a wider context. And you know me, I like to kind of give those extra jewels just to get us to kind of think about some of the wider context of this conversation around young women that are affected by issues around violence. And I guess when we talk about, you know, just kind of concluding the point, we have, you know, gone through this particular unit now and looked at 7 learning outcomes. And I'd like to think that each and every session, you know, you've had that opportunity to really kind of start looking at some of the systemic and social factors that create the environment for the development of gangs, to the way in which gangs behave, but more importantly, to understand the thinking and the thinking that exists within those particular groups, and the thinking that's ultimately linked to behavior, and how those particular behaviors has that wider impact on other young people, on the environment in which young people live. Because it's important that we understand the context, because not every one of us are going to be working with young women in gangs, but we may work with children and young people in our particular locations, environments that may feel the ripple effect of gangs in their particular community, because they may be scared. So there's fear, there's perceived fear, there's traumatic experiences that young people have personally gone through. There's vicarious trauma that exists within those communities, meaning individuals within the vicinity are talking about those experiences that by default make people quite tense and scared. And what consequence does that have, or impact that those narratives have on parents? So parents don't want their children to go outside. And then we're talking about that hypersensitivity that exists within the adults, the elders within the community, that also then exists within schools, because now schools having to talk about those dangers to children by default are feeling quite tense, hypersensitive, and by default may also make decisions that have nothing to do with them joining gangs, but may have a decision process that they make because they want to keep themselves safe. And when we think about things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the things that is important to just acknowledge is that we're talking about survival here. So whether we're talking about young boys or young girls, males or females that are impacted by these issues, we're talking ultimately about survival. And just to kind of conclude the point, that through these particular models, interventions, theoretical positions, and also my personal perspectives on that, what I want you to do is consider, I want you to critique, I want you to adapt, and extend the conversation to think about how all of these things apply in your lens, through your understanding, and be critical about it. So I thank each and every one of you for participating in this unit module. It's been a nice experience. I feel like, as I said in the beginning, that I felt like it's gone really fast, and hopefully I'll see you all soon. So have a good day, have a good evening, depending on what time you have received this message, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.